So we saw spores being used by the non-vascular land plants to get them around. What about the vascular land plants? So spores that we can really identify as spores are found in the vascular plants only in the seedless vascular plants. So it's a little bit hard to compare. They don't quite relate exactly to seeds, but they are a good dispersal unit. So this, again, single cell can get somewhere, it's very effective at dispersing in the wind, and where it lands, it can start a whole new plant, which is beneficial for getting around. So what I've got here are some members of the seedless vascular plant group. We've got lycophytes on the left, horsetails in the middle, and a fern on the right, and highlighting where you might find the spores being produced on those. So in the lycophytes and the horsetails, at least the ones I've got shown here, they've got kind of a cone structure. So that cone is a leaf, one leaf at a time, and that leaf is associated with a spore packet, basically a bundle of spores all packed together. So a lot of spore containers are on each of these, and that ultimately allows for a whole bunch of spores to be dispersed from these locations. On ferns, there's a variety of ways that ferns disperse their spores. One way that you might have encountered already is on the underside of a fern leaf. Sometimes it's dotted with these spore-producing clusters. So under a microscope, there'd be lots of individual spore containers on there, and then altogether a whole bunch of spore release on there. So what we're looking at here, in contrast to the non-vascular land plants, is the green leafy parts on the seedless vascular plants. These are sporophyte. So the sporophyte is self-sufficient, long-lived, and can then go on to produce many of these spore capsules, whereas previously in the non-vascular land plants, we saw each sporophyte was only associated with one spore container. All right, so some interesting features you find in the horsetails. They've got a special kind of spore that's got these appendages on there. What the heck is going on? So this is a spore proper, the circular part, and then they've got these coily bits that go off to the side. Why? Well, it turns out that they are effective at responding to moisture. So again, responding to when the conditions are good for getting them around. As these plants dry out, as their spores dry out, they expand. So they expand and contract in response to changes in humidity, and with some interesting effects. So on the right-hand side, you can see that expanding those arms at just the right time can give you one of these boing effects. I don't have it on here, but you might watch the video for it. If you watch this as a series of expanding and contracting, this actually causes the spores to kind of walk along a surface. So it can give them a little bit of an edge in dispersing to optimal habitat. So that was a horsetail. This is an example from ferns. Not all ferns have this, but some ferns do. On a really microscopic level, this dusty circle here is full of a whole bunch of these catapults that's shown on the right. So tiny things inside of there, these circles are the spores, and the capsule, as the slide title tells you here, has a catapult type of feature. So it actually responds to the air drying out. As the air dries out, it stiffens and kind of backs up and then throws the spores, as we will see here. So this is a collection of those spore capsules drying out. And as they dry out, you can see that sort of a stiff arm goes backwards, and it opens up, kind of tears itself open. And as it completes drying out, it flings forward. Just amazing. Who said plants weren't cool? All right, so we saw, previously I mentioned that the green leafy parts of the seedless vascular plants are the sporophytes. Where are the gametophytes? Or another question, what happens after those spores land? Well, they germinate into short-lived, small, and rather vulnerable phase of the life cycle. So this is that haploid multicellular phase, and its job is to get big enough where it can produce sperm cells and or egg cells, sometimes happening underground. So this one of Selaginella, this has a associates with fungi to get its nutrients and doesn't actually need to do photosynthesis. And somewhere on that disgusting little hairy piece of chewed up gum, somewhere in there, sperm cells and egg cells, they combine together. And after that fertilization, that's the starting point for the much larger sporophyte to develop. So not something you typically see. You got to know where to look, and even then, you don't typically run into these. They're, as I said, short-lived, small, and often hidden, either underground or in dark, shady places. I might skip over this largely. This shows the life cycles and highlights in the purple part there, highlights these interesting sperm cells that are getting around. So gametophytes, the multicellular gametophyte produces either an egg or a sperm. That was a fern example. Here's a horsetail example. Multicellular gametophyte produces an egg or a sperm. Multicellular gametophyte produces an egg or sperm, and those egg and sperm get together and generate the next level. I always thought the fern gametophytes looked a little extraterrestrial here. Okay, so after fertilization, this part of the life cycle starts with a fertilized egg. And it's green to show you that it's diploid. So a fertilized egg is now at the zygote. Zygote grows up through mitosis and becomes a small plant, and then ultimately this larger, visible with the naked eye, fern plant, horsetail plant, lycophyte plant, similar aspects to all of these as they develop. All right, so just a little bit, we'll cover this in much more detail later. Just a little introduction to the seed plants. So seed plants include the non-flowering seed plants, or the gymnosperms, and the flowering seed plants, or the angiosperms. And these both have pollen and ovules. And the pollen and ovules are basically, the pollen grains contain sperm cells, the ovules contain egg cells, and maybe we'll leave it at that for now. But basically the spore, gametophyte, and gamete phase of the life cycle is all compacted down in the seed plants. So we'll cover that a little bit later. So pollen and ovules both found in seed plants, and the fusion of sperm and egg leads to the development of a seed. Both of these kinds of plants have seeds. The flowering plants also have their seeds contained within fruits. All right, so here's some pollen. Pollen's kind of like a spore with a gametophyte and a gamete inside. So I don't want to go into too much detail on this right now, but it's related. We can trace the evolution of this feature, which is kind of interesting. Cycads, one of our groups of gymnosperms, have cones with pollen and cones with ovules. So this is a male cone, this is a female cone. This is similar to what happens in our conifers around here. And I mentioned this one because it's got an interesting connection to insect pollination. So pollination we usually think of as being the domain of the flowering plants, but it turns out that there are insects that are involved in transferring pollen in the gymnosperms, and some of this goes way back. So 110 million years ago, evidence for this, an organism called a thrips with pollen on it, and not accidental. So pollen on the back of this insect, if this has a behavior to go between male cones and female cones, then that would be enough to bring the pollen from one plant to another and achieve pollination. As was concluded in this study, ancient plant has hot, stinky sex. Sometimes you get a nice headline. So the ancient part of this is cycads are a very old lineage of plants. There are fossil cycads going very far back in the fossil record. We still have living cycads today. And some of these cycads are attractive to insects, as shown here. This is a bunch of thrips. These are the scales of a pollen cone. So this is attractive to thrips that come visit it. Kind of an interesting, they found that there is a process in the plant where it is attractive to these thrips, and then it is repulsive to the thrips. So it draws them in with an attractive scent, and then it kicks them out. And this is really, I'm afraid this is about the best resolution this video has, but all those black dots on there are the thrips. They're kind of in the process of jumping ship right now. So if you get thrips to visit your cone, get covered in pollen, and then leave, then you have achieved at least the male part of pollination. The next thing they would need to do is visit the female cones. All right, I'll skip this one. I think that's probably too much for us this time. So moving forward, we're going to talk more about photosynthesis and the kinds of organisms that are capable of photosynthesis.